Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. As you're aware, aging infrastructure is a very prominent topic of discussion in the community association industry today. Whether you're a board member, a resident of an association, property manager, industry service provider, or the state of Florida, we're all very interested in ensuring the safety and integrity of our community and safety of our residents. If you're just joining us, we do have a poll launch, so if you could take a second to fill that out, we'll be reviewing the results in a moment. Before we do get started, I do have a couple of quick housekeeping items. We do have a rather large audience today. We want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we have muted the attendees. However, we do have a Q&A function within Zoom webinars that we'll be utilizing to gather your questions. I will be spending some time at the tail end of today's presentation to go over those questions with you. If this is your first time using Zoom, there's a Q&A icon. It looks like a couple of small chat boxes. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom panel or on the top right-hand side if you have your Zoom panel minimized. We will be recording today's presentation as well, so I'll be making a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the presentation handouts available to you via an email later this afternoon. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the poll results. I'll share that with you. Matt, Lisa, can you guys see that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so our first question was whether or not your community association is currently concerned with structural issues. Looks like about 2/3 of attendees today are concerned with the structural nature of their property. And then taking a look at the last time, when the last time is attendees have had a reserve study completed, it looks like about half of them within the last 3 years. On the other side of the spectrum, about 15% have yet to have their first reserve study. So kind of a wide variety here of experience with the timing of their last reserve study. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over here. We have two great presenters, Matt Queasley, our Regional Executive Director here at Reserve Advisors out of Tampa. And we'll also be hearing from Lisa McGill. She's an attorney over at K. Bender Rembaum. With that, Matt, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy lunch hour, and thanks for joining us. We got a great program for you today. We're going to try to keep it under an hour, but we'll hope to unpack with a lot of good information, pertinent things, and current items. We're going to cover, the common challenges that we have. As the poll showed, many of us are very concerned with structural integrity in our buildings or our community amenities. So we're going to talk about kind of some of the challenges that we've seen recently, why it's such a hot topic, and kind of how we got here. We're going to talk about reserve studies. Of course, that's what our firm does, and we're going to talk about how it differs from engineering inspections. There's kind of some very unique aspects of the reserve study that don't occur in engineering, and vice versa as well. Talk about reserve study best practices. We'll also talk about current legal requirements. This is going to primarily relate to state Florida statutes for condos, HOAs, and co-ops, as well as proposed changes to the requirements. There's quite a few bills right now in Tallahassee that we're all following closely, and we can give you a little insight on where things are as of today. And so just to introduce myself quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Lisa. I'm 21 years of doing reserve studies. I've been with Reserve Advisors that entire time. I'm a professional engineer by trade, a civil and environmental engineer. We work with about 2,500 associations in Florida, closer to 10,000 associations nationwide. So we've got a great scope and breadth of experience working with communities. We work pretty much exclusively with community associations to help them be good fiduciaries of their properties. So we'll talk a lot about that later on. I'm also maybe a glutton for punishment, as I've currently just started my 15th year as a board member in a condominium where I live and own 2 condominiums there. But I get to see the other end of the spectrum a little bit there, and I'm in many of your shoes in those board meetings in the evenings and debating whether to spend money on projects related to infrastructure or other projects for that matter, and try to do the best to protect my investment in those communities. So have that a little bit of experience in both as a board member and a service provider for communities, and very thankful for Lisa for joining us today. Just a huge resource in the legal aspects. So Lisa, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and kick us off.
All right, great. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a really important topic, and I know it's very, very pressing to all of you, as it is to us, as it is been to the entire nation over the last year. My name is Lisa McGill. I'm an attorney at K. Bender Rembaum. I'm board certified in condominium and planned unit development law by the Florida Bar. I'm also a member of the College of Community Association Lawyers, which is the advanced designation offered by CAI. I'm happy to say that Matt and I both participated in CAI's task force this summer or spring into summer that analyzed the laws and processes throughout the United States when it comes to reserve studies or reserve requirements. And we did come up with a set of recommendations for public policies, as well as a set of recommendations for best practices. That was a very enlightening experience for me, because I was one of the few non-reserve specialists or engineers or in the construction industry. So it was very enlightening to hear how the differentials worked and how we are different in Florida. So let's move on to our first slide, I guess. Aging infrastructure, a common challenge. Now, recently, I mean, once the Champlain Towers collapse happened, it was such a tragic event, and we know that that was an anomaly. I mean, it had to be an anomaly. But that being said, all of our community association buildings are deteriorating as each day progresses. Just like our bodies age and require, when you were a teenager, you maybe went to the doctor once every 3 or 4 years. Now, in my advanced age, I seem to be going to the doctor 3 or 4 times a year. So there's a big difference there. But Champlain Towers was not an isolated incident. Well, with respect to collapse, it may be, but with respect to unsafe structures, immediately after the Champlain Towers tragedy occurred, the Crestview Towers, which is also in North Miami Beach, were evacuated. And I heard from one of the state senators, he was listening to the stories of owners that live there. This one owner lived there for close to 30 years, thought he was doing everything that he needed to do. He paid his maintenance, he paid his mortgage, he didn't even have a mortgage anymore, so he had dropped insurance. And lo and behold, at the time of this conversation, he was without a home and without access to all of his possessions. It's not only limited to tall buildings, though. I mean, the Devon Apartments, which was only a 2-floor building, was evacuated. There was a low-rise condo in Coral Springs evacuated, and it's not limited to Florida. So we're not the redheaded stepchild of community associations. Oak Park, Chicago, a 7-floor building was evacuated recently. In Wisconsin, Wisconsin, Horizons West was evacuated, and another example of a small building, a 4-plex rental in Holmes Beach, was evacuated, and that was not even a condo property. So where are we and what can you do right now? So immediately I saw many of you are concerned about the structural integrity of your building. So the immediate steps would be, let's do a review to determine your priorities. If you haven't had a reserve study or an engineering inspection or engaged in major repairs and replacements, now's the time to do it. And I'm glad to see that almost 65% of you have had a reserve study within the past 5 years. That's wonderful. But there are also about 15, I think was close to 20% of you that have never had a reserve study. So you as directors or community leaders, community managers, you need to understand, number one, what components the association bears responsibility for. Now, you can look around and maybe you think that's a simple question to answer, but it's not, because there are components that are not readily observable to you. And if you weren't somebody that was engaged in the construction industry or facilities maintenance industry, then there are all kinds of systems that need attention that are not top of mind. So when you determine your priorities, you're going to want to look at what kind of emergency mitigations do you need to take, are there concrete restoration needs, and of course your fire and life safety. But determining your initial priorities and then creating a strategic plan to address not all areas. I write here in the slide all areas in disrepair, but it's not necessarily areas that are in disrepair. Of course, you're going to work on those first, but you want a strategic plan to determine how you're going to meet the needs of the buildings and improvements going forward. And of course, meeting the needs of the buildings and improvements going forward, your financial plan, a reserve analyst or reserve reserve specialist can help you not only with calculating what components for which you bear responsibility, calculating the possible future costs associated with those components, but can also help you with that financial plan. So, what are your abilities to levy a special assessment? Do your owners have the wherewithal to fund a special assessment? What have you done with reserves? If you haven't collected reserves, it's never too late to start. You obviously would like to probably start a little slow at first, but building up that nest egg is very, very important. And most community associations in Florida, there are plenty of lenders out there that are willing to offer financing depending on the nature of the equity of the building. Finally, I know nobody has extraneous expenses in their budget, but in some situations, maybe it's time to reevaluate where your priorities are as far as your expenses are concerned, so that you can meet the needs of the important maintenance and repair responsibilities that you all have as community leaders, community managers. Now, we're talking about community leaders and community managers. I know many of out there are CAMs, and we're preaching to the choir here, because you may have been saying the same things to your boards over the years. It's never wrong to keep saying it and keep reminding them, because you have different boards, different times, different mindsets, and different owners. So you keep on keeping on when it comes to giving them your good advice with regard to the financial planning and the maintenance and repair of the property improvements. Let's move on the next slide. So how did we get here? So this is really focused on Florida, because that's obviously where my practice is. But where did we get there? Is there a lack of government oversight? And we talk about construction defects. Most of you in new buildings, hopefully after the construction was complete and you turned over from developer control to unit owner control, you hired an engineering company to come and evaluate the as-built construction to determine whether there were any defects. But not all defects are readily observable. Like, it would be very difficult in the Champlain Towers instance, it would be very difficult to know how many pilings or how much rebar was inserted in each one of the columns. So construction defects, is there a lack of government oversight? One of the things that we did talk about through our CAS task force is to really put more emphasis on the beginning, put more emphasis on ensuring that there are code inspectors and building officials that will monitor the construction of buildings so as to try to avoid some of the problems that you have afterwards. Same thing is true. We're all involved in possible funding issues ourselves. Our budgets may be tight, our financial constraints may be tight. Well, your cities and your counties and your other building officials are in that same situation. So through CAI and through some of the other efforts that we've engaged in, devoting more effort, devoting more resources, devoting more time to ensure that the building officials have the right personnel in place to perform evaluations, or at least eyeball situations before they get to a point where there's imminent failure, is important. And then government oversight in Florida. We're going to talk about exactly what the law says right now, but there's no reserve study mandate. Now, we know that the law does say a board of a condo or a co-op must adopt a budget containing fully funded reserves. But that term, fully funded, is very amorphous, very subjective. It shouldn't be, but it should be, but it is subjective. And what we find is, without a reserve study, without a professional to tell you what your components are and the square footage or the extent of the components, you're probably missing a lot of things in your reserve schedule, even if you've tried to do that yeoman's job in putting together a sufficient reserve schedule. So absence of reserve study mandate, I think, is one of the ways that we got here in Florida with respect to many of our properties. Now, board members, they're not intended, the law is not intended to have every board member be an expert in every field. They're not intended to be engineers. You don't need to be an accountant or a lawyer or an insurance professional to serve on the board. It's intended to be a user-friendly experience for volunteers to take care of the properties for which they're entrusted. But does that mean that they are automatically able to monitor and maintain and oversee significant buildings and improvements? I mean, many of you have properties where $100 million, $200 million worth of assets. So how did we get here? We don't have maintenance manuals or defined protocols in Florida for maintenance, repair, obligations. That's something that I think I would hope that now our community association leaders are really looking to their professionals to help them develop those protocols so that this board and future boards have guidelines to follow when it comes to building and property maintenance. And again, board's failure to collect reserves to address component life cycle issues. You'll see that maybe the life of something was 20 years. I see this all the time in my role as an attorney. Last year's reserve budget said the existing remaining life for the roof was 8 years. I get it back this year. All of a sudden, the existing remaining life of the roof is now 12 years. And then another year goes by, now it's another 12 years. So again, without that professional reserve study, you really are kind of shooting in the dark as to what your obligations are. We know demands and pressures. There's so much of a demand to keep maintenance fees low. I mean, this could be on the board side, this could be on the owner side, it could be pressure from all over in order to keep your sales prices higher. There's apparently seemingly a benefit to the property if the maintenance fee is low. And that's something that we really need to get away from. As community leaders, you are fiduciaries. You have fiduciary duties and to act in the best interests of the association. So sometimes that means you have to put aside your particular desire to keep your fee or your monthly assessment at a certain rate and really look at what the needs of the association are and put those needs ahead of your needs. The same thing is true with piecemeal repairs and patches. How many of you have been in a situation, and I've been at board meetings where there are significant arguments over this. Why are we doing this big project? Our engineer is, all he or she wants to do is make more money and increase the cost of this project. Why can't we just, patch it? Why do we have to replace the roof? Or, why do we have to chip out as much concrete as we can? That's where I find working with professional consultants, engineers or roof consultants and elevator consultants can really help you, because they can help you evaluate whether your future costs, whether if you spend the extra money now, how much you're going to be saving over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And of course, pressure from owners for beautification or amenity enhancements. I've been at those same meetings where the board is considering modernizing the elevators or working on expansion joints in the garage, and you have owners that are screaming, we don't care if our cars get wet in the garage. Why are the tennis courts completely falling apart? Or how come we don't have a pool that has a beach entrance? Or how come we don't have like the nicest things that we should have, considering the value of our units are so high? Finally, this is something where we really need to change the mindset, because it's lack of intergenerational equity. So if you take a look, if you type into Google intergenerational equity, you'll find a lot of information out there. But the average ownership of a house is 13 to 16 years. the average ownership of a condo is 5 to 8 years. So you have that lack of the forward thinking or the longevity thinking. But really, where we need to change the mindset is to make everyone, all owners, all purchasers, all sellers, all community leaders understand that when you own this property, you're responsible for this property. And responsibility not only includes just keeping your head above water, swimming along the tide and keeping your head above water. It really includes contemplating the future needs of the property and contemplating and paying for or addressing the deterioration of the property over time. Same thing is true with age of owners, whether you're on the young side or whether you're on the older side. Older folks may not want to buy green bananas because they don't see the benefit and planning for the future. And young owners may feel, yeah, 5 years from now, 3 years from now, I'm going to get married, buy it, move into a big house, and have my kids in my yard and what have you. So really, the mindset and we need to rely on the real estate industry a little bit for this too, is to not only judge affordability by your exact maintenance and the exact mortgage, taxes, and insurance, but to judge affordability based upon the actual and real true needs of the property and your responsibility as an owner or as a community leader. So we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, Lisa, I just want to jump on that last point a little bit. I think you were a part of the Broward Coalition as well, where they did the mayors in Broward County, and I will never forget the mayor of Highland Beach sharing that when they did their censuses, they found the highest level of poverty was actually older females living on the beach, and they did not have enough money to maintain those communities. They had moved down, bought the condo 40 years ago, 50 years ago, had plenty of money then, but maybe outlived some of their retirement savings, and now they live in a community they really can't afford, which is a really sad situation, especially if maintenance was deferred or neglected, and the reserves weren't set up for those communities. Now they're facing special assessments, and they are having trouble making the monthly payments as it was. They're going to have even a harder time with assessments. So
and if I could just interrupt you, going on that point, no legislator wants to be the one that adopts a law that's going to displace people from their own homes. So this has to be done on the ground by us as owners.
Right.
And it's a really sad situation, but think about that person that was displaced that owned the condo for 30 years. He thought he was doing everything right. So where our role can come in as professionals is to make sure that people understand that there are needs, and by planning for those needs going forward, you'll be in a much better place later on.
Right, just getting people prepared. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and just talk a little bit about the reserve study. Lisa mentioned it a number of times already, and how it differs from an engineering study. Because as someone that is a professional engineer, but also a reserve study, kind of am uniquely positioned. I get asked a lot, can we do an engineering study? Should we do a reserve study? What is that? What is the difference? And when is each appropriate? And my point today is going to be like, both of these studies definitely have their place. There's a time and a frequency for each of these studies. There are very different animals. The reserve study focuses on budget planning, and it really looks at a holistic approach of all the components in the building to provide that stable, equitable funding plan that we were talking about that allows communities to ensure that the owners 5, 10, 15 years from now are going to not be in a situation where there's big surprises, big increases if they follow the reserves. The reserve study lays out that plan. It's a budget planning tool. Because it's forecasting out usually 20 or 30 years in the future, it is something that is inherently inaccurate. There is certainly, it's a tool, but it's just like any budget. It's going to be needed to be revisited as time goes on. So typically reserve studies done a little more frequently than an engineering study does, and they're relatively inexpensive. Studies usually almost always less than $10,000 for a reserve study, whereas an engineering study almost always more than $10,000 for most buildings. They can often, they can reach high five figures depending on the level, the scope, and the detail of the study. Generally, when we look at engineering studies, there's not like one exact definition of what an engineering study is. That's kind of it's not a well-defined term. There are standards on structural assessments, condition assessments of existing buildings. The ASC, American Society of Civil Engineers, and the Structural Engineering Institute, SEI, have published standards. There's 160-page manual called the ANSI 11-99 that identifies, all the steps to take to do a full condition assessment of a property. It tends to, these studies tend to exclude some of the common components that our community has mentioned. Like Lisa, I've been in many board meetings where the hot topic is maybe an aesthetic item, a tennis court, the lobby renovation, the clubhouse. And these are big dollar items that communities will budget for and spend money on, but that may not be something that's studied in an engineering study. Engineering studies tend to focus on the structural components of the building, maybe the life safety components, and not necessarily the frequency with which you're going to place the carpet in the hallways or the furnishings in the lobby. So it's more of a focused in study and identifying more immediate repairs and replacements. So the things that need to be done now generally are identified in the reserve study, not in the engineering study, not just not items that need to be done 20, 30 years from now. So that's kind of a high level. I'll go into a little more detail on the next slide. I think who can do them is a big piece of the differentiator on the studies. So reserve studies have a couple of professional designations out there. One's developed by Community Associations Institute, who, if any of you are not familiar with, I strongly encourage you to look up this organization. They're a wonderful organization, nationwide, actually worldwide organization with local chapters. Got 8 chapters here in the state of Florida that really help educate and also provide these designations for community association managers, insurance professionals, reserve specialists, etc. These people have 3 years of experience doing reserve studies. They meet that they follow the National Reserve Study Standards. They have ethical and education requirements as well. Similarly, the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts is an organization that has a designation for reserve studies as well, called the Professional Reserve Analyst designation, PRA. This one's a little more popular on the West Coast, so the Western United States, not necessarily. There are a few. I do have this designation. There's a few in the state. Now, with these 2 designations, we could probably fit all of the people that have reserve specialists and PRAs in one big room. We may have more people on this webinar than we have all together in the country that have those designations. So there's a little bit of a limitation there as well. Similarly, on the other side, professional designations of professional engineers, architects, and special inspectors of threshold buildings. I think that last category, we heard from one of the legislatures that there's less than 650 of these in the state of Florida, which you think about how many buildings we have. There are some limitations there on who's eligible to provide these studies, and do we have enough, any laws that they're looking at now. It's like, do we have enough people to get these studies done within a reasonable time frame? Or are we going to overtax the system? We're simply not going to be able to not have enough people to provide these levels of service and that have this level of expertise. So those are generally, all 3 of those are state designations. Each state has their own professional engineer licensed in each state to be a professional engineer or architect. The special inspectors of threshold buildings is a professional engineer that has some additional qualifications based on designing designing or inspecting structural buildings. And threshold buildings would be buildings generally taller than 50 feet, generally taller than 3 stories. The standards I mentioned earlier, the ASCE standard guideline, the National Reserve Study Standards. These are the guidance that are provided with these 2 studies, 2 completely different sets of requirements. Again, the National Reserve Study Standards, have a definition of what should be included, and it's basically everything that's the association responsibility that has a predictable remaining useful life and is above a certain cost threshold. So we're looking at, again, more holistic look at everything within your community. The structural condition assessment guideline focuses again on the structural members and some non-structural members, but they call out very few in that specification outside of the structural items. Going further, if you want to advance again, the engineering studies generally determine one of the big pieces, and one of the big questions we get is, is my building safe? Of course, after the collapse, we get a lot of calls. Can you tell us if our building's structurally sound? In order to really fully be able to do this, and I think it's I think the people at Champlain asked themselves probably this very thing, and had some studies that were beginning and some work that was done on this. I don't think anyone could have seen some of the underlying issues inside the columns, underneath the plaza deck membrane, that the deterioration or the original design was potentially deficient. We still don't know that, I don't think, and those studies will probably be ongoing for many more years. But we have very different tools, kind of specific testing protocols that get followed on the engineering studies to determine, if the structure was constructed, first of all, to the original design, if the original design was adequate, and to confirm that the loads ensure the strength, that the columns, the beams, the members of the building still have that strength. So often engineering studies kind of go into phases, and one of the laws that's proposed that we'll talk about in a little bit is kind of a initial phase, which is visual observations, and then the next phase, if the visual observation identifies something, the more detailed assessment to determine the extent of repairs, the extent of deterioration, the extent of missing issues. And then really, again, part of this engineering study is developing a specification for immediate repairs to ensure the structural integrity of the building. It's looking for other work, environmental conditions where over time the building may have experienced more wear and tear, and exactly what needs to be done to bring it back up to strength. Again, using design professionals, using those the professional engineers or architects or the special inspectors to do those studies. The reserve studies are again, more it's a visual, just to repeat, it's a visual inspection. There's no destructive testing or design or defect analysis as a part of the reserve study. The real important part, and one of the things that again is not included in most engineering studies, is really identifying and quantifying all the components. So how much roofing do you have? And a lot of communities, the roof, depending on the type of the community, roof might be the most expensive item that we have, individual item. And how many square feet of that do we have? How many years is it going to last? How is it being maintained? What's the maintenance program on that? It's not going to last forever. And I think that's one of the important aspects of this that we're still, I think, working with our legislator on. Like Lisa said, there's a requirement to do reserves, but many communities waive it or don't have a really great grasp on what's exactly needed. Well, what happens when we don't have reserves? We got kind of a few options, right? We can, the roof in that example, it's going to fail. When it fails, it fails. There's not much we can do at some point, especially with certain materials, to extend the life beyond 20, 25 years on a roofing material. Nothing, especially in Florida in our harsh environment, is going to last forever. So we can, if we have reserves, hopefully we can take care of the project right away, pay for the project, and use the reserve funds that we've been saving up. That's what we feel is, again, the most equitable way to do things. But there are a couple other options. There are banks that will lend for those projects. But of course, that depends on the financial health of the community, and also incur some extra costs. So one of the big objections we get, some of you may have heard this, I've heard this in my own board meetings, is that we couldn't afford to fund our reserves. And Lisa mentioned there's this pressure to keep fees low. We couldn't afford to fund the reserves. Well, the other option, the loan, is going to be more expensive. The special assessment is going to be just as expensive, if not more. And then your fourth option is to do nothing, to ignore that roof that's leaking, or ignore that concrete that's falling, or the railing that's rusted through. And we know that's by far the most expensive option. So when you hear, I challenge you in your board meetings, say we can't afford reserves, remind them of the other options they have. And I'll repeat what Lisa said earlier, as a fiduciary, our boards, we have to assess these items and put these items on the radar, because while you might hear, I'm not going to be here in 5 years, I'm not going to be here in 10 years. I challenge you all as board members to think about what your duty is, and that's to typically the Condominium Association Incorporated. Is that corporation going to be here in 5 or 10, 15 years? And let's make decisions based on that. But so I got a little off track there, but I want to just, looking at the maintenance, use, repair history, all of these items, understanding, what's needed, what conditions you're in, are you close to the water? Are you in Florida? Are we in a case where, we're at high use, maybe we're may have a lot of rentals or something, where we have a lot of in check-in and check-outs in our building. Well, that's going to affect the useful life of some of our elements. Maybe our elevators need to be repaired more frequently. Of course, the salt air, we all know, can have a really detrimental effect on metal and concrete and steel components, the reinforcement there. So the reserve study is is two parts: is a physical analysis and a financial analysis. This slide just covers the physical analysis side, really projecting costs again for repairs or replacements. We might use historical costs of other buildings, what they experienced, etc. And then I think the next slide we talk a little bit about the some of the other items. I think kind of covered this. The reserve study should include all of these items at a minimum. And these are the kind of the key life safety concerns that are still incorporated in your reserve study. So while an engineering study, like we said, will focus in on maybe concrete restoration, it might focus in on your electrical system, etc. It may not include everything, but these are the big items that we identify in reserves as the big money items. Whether it's balconies, plaza deck membranes is a huge one, facades and waterproofing, all types of plumbing, electrical, distribution center systems, generators, elevators. I mentioned life safety systems. All of these items should be in your reserve study, so they should be on your radar, right? So that they don't catch the board by surprise, and so that there's money to be able to fund for them. So looking forward, what is the reserve? What can a reserve study tell us? It's again just kind of a recap on the reserve study. It's going to be your consistent, stable plan. Boards, in our industry, it never ceases to amaze me how difficult it is to keep up with the clients. I mentioned we have a lot of clients in Florida. Well, each day, and we can attest to that, I'm sure Lisa has the same situation. There's a new manager at one of our properties. There's a new board taking on this time of year. There's, most of the properties have at least some new board members coming on board. So that turnover can create some inconsistency, and there's not too many other properties when you think about other commercial properties or rental properties and things that turn over ownership and turn over leadership that quickly. Not many businesses that turn over that frequently and that often. And so that's a challenge, I think, an inherent challenge that we have, that having new people, maybe new agenda, new items each year can get us off track. But the reserve is what hopefully keeps us on track. One other thing I want to just mention, and then I'll turn it back over to Lisa, the reserve providers, as we look at, we kind of liken ourselves to like the generalists, the physical exam that you go to once a year, or like Lisa said, maybe a little more frequently as we age, to determine if anything's out of line, if anything needs a little bit more closer look. And then what we do, we call them the specialists. So it's important to think of, having that general checkup every so often, like I said, more frequently, and hopefully fairly infrequently having to call in the structural specialists to do a more in-depth engineering study. They also work hand in hand. Again, the reserve study can and should include a line item for those occasional deeper investigations. So because those aren't cheap, as I already alluded to. So if you want to have a 20-year or 30-year structural inspection, you can put that in the reserve study to pay for it. The cost of the study itself is in the reserve, so you've got money set aside for that. And then whatever the results of that study are, that may recommend again further repairs. Those can be incorporated in the reserve study again. So the reserve study is kind of the funding mechanism that supports the physical deterioration of the building or the physical needs of the building, and overall leads hopefully to a path of financial health and just again documenting the conditions, documenting what's been done at a building, over time is a challenge again with the turnover. So those are the kind of the benefits of reserve study can tell us, and a little bit how it's different from an engineering study. I think at this point I'm going to turn over to Lisa as we talk a little bit about the law, back to like the legal aspects.
Well, thank you. And I really like the way that you put that with the generalist and the specialist. If we go back to our doctor comparison, you go for your annual exam just to make sure everything is doing okay. Your doctor sees something or finds something, says, okay, you have an ear, nose, and throat issue. Let's go check it out. Well, it's the same thing with your buildings. You have the reserves to say, hey, this is the type of construction you have. This is based upon the existing condition. Here's how long I think it's going to last. And here's what your anticipated cost is when it needs to be replaced or substantially repaired. Conversely, when something's wrong with your plumbing, or something's, you see concrete spalling or things chipping off your outside of the building, or your elevators aren't working right, then you bring in the engineer, say, hey, evaluate this, tell me what's wrong, tell me what I need to do to fix it. So they work in conjunction with each other, and they're both very, very effective. Let's talk about what the current legal requirements in Florida are. Condos and co-ops, as I said, you must contain a fully funded reserve schedule for roof, paint, paving, and any other expense that is anticipated to cost more than $10,000. So first thing for you all to do, go back home or open up your files, see what you have in your reserve study. Is it in your reserve schedule? Is it just roof, paint, and paving? Well, think about it. Do you have elevators? Do you have seawalls? Do you have traffic decks or garage structures? Do you have pool decks or what have you? So all those items. Do you have roads? Think about all those items that you know are going to cost more than $10,000, and then reevaluate whether or not your reserves are really adequate. In the HOAs, it's a bifurcated process, and I think it's going to be changing. But right now, there's only two forms of mandatory reserves in HOAs: those that were initially included in the budget by the developer and funded in connection with transition, and those that are voted in by the majority of the owner. I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and I've never seen a membership voluntarily vote to add a reserve to their budget. It just doesn't happen. But we said the problem was there's no requirement to use a professional to assist with compiling the schedule. So what is the veracity of your schedule? How reliable is your schedule unless you have that assistance? And also we know it can be waived entirely or partially with the vote of the majority of the quorum of the membership. So you can co-op and condo owners and HOA owners, they can vote to waive reserves indefinitely, and then all of a sudden some of the major expense items catch up on you. Of course, the vote does include that statutory warning notice. That's one of the issues I want to also import to you. Having the reserve study, having this information is an important disclosure. If you're on your board, do you want to be the one that says, oh, the roof just came out of nowhere? No, you want to have a document that you furnish to your members and to your purchasers on an annual basis or as frequently as you think necessary to say, hey, these are the things that are coming down the pike. We want you to know that our roof is up in 6 years. Our elevators are coming up in 8 years. So it's important for you not only for your edification so that you know what to do, but it's important for you to educate your owners so that they are not caught by surprise at the end of the day. And of course, in Florida, the reserves can be calculated using the pool or the straight line methodology. It's also known as the cash flow method versus the component method. A straight line is if you're funding for roof, the money stays in roof unless there's a vote to move it to something else. On a cash flow method, you have a pool of money that will anticipate your needs on whatever the yearly basis is, but the money is not restricted by category. The money is there for whatever need you have at the time. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, well, after Surfside, I'm sure you can imagine, and this is true in other states as well, there's a plethora of pending or proposed legislation out there. But also legislators are loath to be too reactive to a situation. So what we're hearing is the most likely vehicle for change will be the Senate Bill 1702. It will create mandatory inspections for multifamily buildings. And the inspection is not to determine whether everything is in compliance with code or whether there's any slight problems or slight deviations or aesthetic problems. It's really designed to ensure that the buildings are structurally safe and sound. If you're in Miami-Dade County or Broward County, we have what's known as the recertification or the building safety inspection program. That's a 40-year inspection. My take on this SB 1702 is very much like extending that building safety inspection program statewide, but it changes the timing a little bit. So a milestone, will impact buildings 3 stories or higher. Now, remember, this is pending. We don't know if it will be adopted or whether it will be adopted as it exists now or whether there'll be changes. More likely than not, there'll be some changes. But this bill would require the initial inspection within 30 years and updates every 10 years, unless the buildings are located within 3 miles of the coast. And that makes the inspection schedule a little bit more aggressive, the initial inspection at 20 years with updates every 7 years. Now, catching it early is the most important thing, because if you can catch problems early and address them early, then you're saving yourself 3, 4, 5 times what you could cost in the corrective maintenance if you had waited or didn't know about it. Some other items that are included in the bill: the engineer will furnish the board, of course, with a copy of the report. It also requires the engineer that performs the inspection to furnish the local building official with the report. The board must distribute the report to all owners. I think that goes without saying, and the report becomes an official record subject to inspection. If you do have a website, then you're also required to post the report on the website. And again, for disclosure purposes, that report and subsequent reports are furnished to prospective buyers in connection with the sale or transfer procedure. But we can move on, I guess.
Lisa, real quick, a couple of questions that just came in about current legislation or requirements. What is the statutory notice for waiver of full funding of reserves? And does the warning have to be in writing? And when does it need to be given?
Yes, the warning has to be in writing. The warning is right in the actual statute. It says something along the lines that notice, waiver of reserves, or waiver of partial reserves may require you to have special assessments in the future. So that it's in capital letters. It's required to be on every proxy or every ballot when you're actually voting. The actual voting document needs to contain that language. Typically, they're done at membership meetings. So membership meetings are typically noticed at least 14 days in advance. I mean, there are some additional notice requirements for annual meetings and the like, but membership meetings are typically noticed 14 days in advance.
Thank you.
We can, should we go to talk about our conclusions, or should we answer some questions? There are a lot of really good questions I noticed in here.
Yeah, we can jump into the questions. I can either present them to you, or if you guys want to take a look and choose which ones you want. There's a variety of topics that it looks like we could cover.
Well, a lot of the issues I think relate to insurance. Insurance is really precarious, particularly in Florida, but I think this is being experienced nationwide. I know from my own experience, my own clients, even those that have been on top of their maintenance, so they don't have major problems. I mean, every older building has issues that they have to address, but no major problems. And their insurance more than doubled. I think it went from $300,000 to over $700,000. I mean, that's just not affordable. Or if it is, it's not affordable within the budget projections that you had last year. So you'll either have to be financing the insurance premium. Some insurance carriers are requiring the associations to obtain inspections. Some of the insurance carriers are saying, we're not going to insure you if the roof is over a certain age or you haven't had your 40-year certification. So if you're 38, I'm in Broward County. So if you're a building that's 38 years old, of course, you're not going to have your 40-year certification because you're not 40 years old yet. But does that mean that the insurer should say, well, we're not insuring you until you go through 40-year certification? Really, really difficult issues right now when it comes to insurance. And there was also a question about the insurance appraisal. The insurance appraisal is really for the insurance company. It's not for you. It doesn't say anything really about the existing conditions of the building. It really is just to determine what the rebuilding costs are and whether those are accurate or not. You know, it's really for the insurance company to determine how to underwrite your program of insurance. Go ahead, Matt. I see you looking at something.
Yeah, no, I was going to add, now insurance appraisals are required by statute right now too. We should mention for condos every 36 months. They are required to have an updated independent insurance appraisal. And Lisa's exactly right. That's just going to tell you what are the limits of property insurance. So it will tell you, the type of construction that you have and things, but it is a very, again, a third kind of not an engineering study, not a reserve study, but a separate study that tells you, okay, this building is worth $80 million. If it was to get knocked down to the ground, that's how much we should have it insured for, ideally. But yeah, this is an insurance market like I can't remember seeing in my career here. Just to echo what Lisa's saying, it's just an extremely difficult market, or they call it a hard market, kind of a perfect storm of things from Irma claims to wildfires to Texas freeze. Have really hurt these insurance companies. At least that's what they're telling us, and they're pulling out of the state. They're just not like we said, just denying or refusing to insure some buildings, which is a huge challenge. And we'll kind of have to see where that goes. I'm afraid we're going to see a big increase in citizens insurance again, which we had right after the hurricanes. A similar thing happened, I guess, maybe not to this extent, but maybe similar after the hurricanes in 2005, where all of a sudden now Citizens, which was supposed to be the insurer of last resort, became the largest insurer in the state. And we hope that it doesn't happen again, but it may be coming. Good, yeah, great questions about insurance. Specific question about electrical there. I don't think we can probably get into that. That's probably dependent on the documents of that specific community. So sorry, we can't answer that one here. I am not Tony Soprano in hiding. Great question though. You can forget about it. Yeah.
I smiled at that.
Turnover concerns. So this is another important, actually another type of engineering study. That's a good question, Denise. What do we do with turnover concerns? So, and there's actually another bill proposed that really applies to this as well. The construction defect bill that's out there now. I don't know that we'll have time to get into that generally, but best practice, again, before you, if you're turning over a new community, if you're a board member that's taking over from the developer, you're preparing to take over from the developer, a third-party engineering study can help you identify any defects. They're quite expensive as well, again, initially, but it's going to be something that's going to hopefully give a clean bill of health and catch any obvious defects that have manifested themselves early on in the process. Do you want to add anything about defects, Lisa?
Well, so I saw, no, I mean, that's a whole topic altogether, but I did see a couple of questions or comments about smaller buildings or low-rise buildings. Now, this particular statute will impact, if it's adopted, of course, buildings that are over 3 stories. But the question was, so it would not apply to coach homes. Again, and if you're in Miami-Dade or Broward County, you may be covered by the Building Safety Reinspection Program. But is it a good idea? Definitely a good idea for any type of community. And you may even be able to start with a reserve study and have your reserve analyst tell you, hey, I see something here that doesn't look right. I recommend that you get an engineering evaluation for the pipes, the roofs, whatever it is, the surface water management system, whatever it is that they see. And that would decrease your expense, because the reserve studies are far less expensive than an engineering study. But if you are an older building and you haven't attended to maintenance, like white on rice is what I call it, then you definitely want to have some kind of an evaluation, just so that you can assure yourself that everything is copacetic, and that so you could put yourselves on a plan to make sure that things are addressed on a timely basis going forward.
Good question. Yeah.
So is a new owner buy-in fee common for funding reserves? Now, in condos and co-ops, there is no such thing as what we call flip tax, or basically a capital contribution fee after the initial sales by the developer. And that's designed by the statute. A lot of HOAs, though, are now requiring some type of a capital contribution fee for resale purchasers. And it can be as little as 2 months worth of maintenance, or it can be, $1,500, $2,500, whatever it is that they put into their documents. I don't know if we're going to see any changes to the statute that would enable condos and co-ops to create these capital contribution fees. But remember, why are we sticking it to or saddling new people with the cost of the deterioration that happened over the last 5, 10, 15 years? Really, the responsibility to pay for that deterioration rests with the people that have enjoyed the use of those common elements over that period of time. So I don't see that we don't have those flip taxes. If you were in New York or some other state, there are significant fees that are either paid to the sponsor or to the association in connection with the purchase. We don't have those right now in Florida.
We're coming up here on the hour. Matt, do you want to address the underground infrastructure? Then maybe Lisa, there's a few questions to, kind of reiterating the current waiver requirements and future requirements on story. So maybe revisit that briefly as well.
Yes.
Sure. What was the question on? Is this will slab and subsurface areas typically be included in engineering evaluations?
Yeah. So there's that one, and there was also a comment about underground infrastructure that it was excluded from a reserve study, and it was actually their biggest mandated expense. Maybe we could touch base on how those components are included in the reserve study.
Sure. So the reserve study, again, because it's visual in nature, we can't identify. You can put our eyes on the items below, but what we do, and one of the benefits of the reserve study, kind of like going back to that general practitioner, is that we have a look at probably more buildings, more communities than any other type of firm, because we're looking at a lot of different items. So when we find out, okay, we've got subsurface items, whether let's use piping as an example, stormwater piping, we know that we can understand the type of the pipe, understand the age of the pipe, understand the history of repairs or replacements. We can come up with some budgetary estimates to make sure we've got funds for what usually happens is partial replacements or perhaps a relining of the entire system. We rarely would see the need to tear out and replace all of the subsurface utilities or something of that nature, unless the property is telling us something else. So we would include it in the reserve study, and as far as like in an engineering study, you just have to specify the scope. And I think that's one thing I would stress all of us, like, when we talk about an engineering study, there's a bunch of different levels again. So if you want an engineering study that includes ground penetrating radar, for example, to look at where the actual pipe is located, make sure you specify that in your requested scope from the engineer that you're getting bids from. There we'll have to we will get back to some of these questions. We will run out of time here, but in the interest of everyone's time, we will get to some of these questions via email. Lisa, you had one, or you're going to answer one more.
So the reserve, the question was about the warning notice. It's in, for the Condo Act, it's in 718.112. In the Co-op Act, it's in 718.106. I don't see the actual disclaimer language right now as I'm searching for it, but here's the language. It says in capital letters, it's supposed to be one size larger font than the other letters on either the proxy or the ballot. It says waiving of reserves in whole or in part, or allowing alternative uses of existing reserves may result in unit owner liability for payment of unanticipated special assessments regarding those items. So that's the warning that is given to the owners in connection with the vote on the waiver of reserves. There was a question, say, must the board allow owners to vote on the waiver of reserves? The board sets the agenda for membership meetings. So you don't have to include a reserve waiver vote in your annual meeting or as a special meeting in connection with your budget meeting. Now, of course, if you haven't reserved for a very long time and it's going to be a huge differential in the payments that people were accustomed to, then that may lead to owners petitioning for a special meeting to vote on that purpose, or even more significantly, owners petitioning to recall members of the board or change the board. So you have to be a little bit sensitive to what your community appetite and what could be reasonably accomplished in your community. As I said, there's no reason you can't start slow. If you haven't, if you're really behind the 8 ball, start slow, keep going. I represent one community in Miami-Dade County. It's a 55 and over community, and the owners are of advanced age, and they were voting on the reserve question. And the question was first was the waiver, and then if you don't vote to waive, partial waiver. And the figures they showed that in between $18 and $24 a month per unit, depending on the unit size, was going to result in $75,000 of money, reserve money, at the end of the year. And my pleas fell on deaf ears, but for $18 to $24 a month, and you could have 75 grand at the end of the year, and then the following year be 150 grand, and the following year $225,000. I mean, again, that seems very, very prudent to me, but that initiative was defeated, and they're continuing on their previous path. Now, I am happy to say that particular community is like white on rice when it comes to every 7 years the painting and checking this and checking that, and every single inspection that is required. So I do feel comfortable with them, but I really, if you can start slow with $18 to $24, then you're just going to be way ahead of the game in the event you're going to need to use that money later on, and you will need to use that money later on.
Very good.
So I guess we conclude. Do you want to go through what our conclusions?
Well, yeah, I just really quick, just, that again, to recap that, we think reserve funding is really the most equitable way to pay for owners, and to pay as you go. Like Lisa said, a little bit today, a little bit each month will help. It's, just like saving for college or retirement, those expenses will be needed. And the more we can encourage our communities to put it away for the items that they're using every day. That's another concept we didn't talk too much about, but each owner is enjoying the benefit of that roof, enjoying the benefit of the swimming pool, whether they use it or not. They're enjoying those benefits each and every day, and it's wearing each and every day. So let's set aside some funds to offset that wear and tear, to hopefully lead to lower costs over the life of the association. And then I'll just a couple to touch on the last two as well. Just as a building ages, more intrusive, more expansive engineering studies are going to be likely. They likely will be something that's coming down the pike as far as a legal requirement, we think. And there's really no substitute for professional studies. As a board member, I know from wearing that hat, you don't get paid enough to take on the liability and to try to do these things yourself. It's not your fault that a building is going to wear and tear over time. You don't need to take it personally. The best thing to do is disclose to the owners what the true needs are, and I think that's my best advice to you. Any last words, Lisa?
I think that's all great stuff. Again, you're not expected as a board member, you're a volunteer. You're not expected to be an engineer. You're not expected to be an accountant. You're not expected to be an insurance professional. You are expected to take whatever action you need to give yourself the resources that you need to make good decisions. So go for it, do that. Engage the professionals to perform these types of services, because in the end, you'll benefit. Everyone will benefit from it. So I do thank everyone for participating today. I know it was a short period of time to cover a lot of material, but as indicated earlier, we are going to send out a copy of the video And any other concluding remarks, Matthew?
Yeah, we'll put our contact information in that email as well. Everybody will get that. So we'll do our best to get back to some of the other questions that we weren't able to answer today, but really appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you. And especially thank you, Lisa.
Oh, thank you, Matt. This is great.
Thank you guys for your time. Everybody have a great afternoon.